That's for everyone to know. I suppose there's a California law about that. Oh, Mark,
Ron.
I forgot to ask. Do you know why birds? We have lots of scientists on this webinar series. Do you know why scientists have found that birds actually fly south for the winter?
Oh, no. Why do they fly south for the winter?
Because as many of our Lab S students could point out, it's just too far to walk.
That's true.
Sorry.
That's
I,
true.
I,
And,
I
and
can
speak
I can I can hear the moans coming
and
already.
and speaking of scientists, you know about the two statistics professors who were duck hunting and a
No,
mallard.
no, I
Yeah,
don't. Tell me about it.
yeah. The two statistics professors. They were duck hunting, and a mallard flew right by them. And the
Uh-huh.
first one, bam, took a shot, but missed it about maybe 20 feet to the left. Second one, bam, took a shot, missed it about 20 feet to the right. And then they said, "Congratulations! On average, we got him." And the mallard kept on going.
Oh boy. So Mark,
Yes,
do you
Ron.
know what kind of bird you find at a construction site?
What kind of bird do you find at a construction site? Maybe a crane?
Lab S could have confirmed it. Definitely a
I
crane.
think so.
Yes. Do you have any more?
No.
Okay, thank goodness. Okay, with that, I think we're going to introduce Susan, who will actually introduce the program for tonight. Susan?
Okay, thank you, Ron. Well, we're very pleased to have Dr. John McCormick with us again tonight. Dr. McCormick is director and curator of the Moore Laboratory of Zoology and an associate professor of biology at Occidental College. John received his PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from UCLA and his undergraduate degree from the University of Arizona. John has multiple publications in peer-reviewed journals, including Evolution, Systematic Biology, Ornithology, and many more. John and his team at the Moore Lab of Zoology have received a National Science Foundation Career Award for a 5-year project to resurvey the birds of Mexico. Their goal is to see how both the distributions and genomes of Mexican birds have changed over the last 100 years. The project, called the Mexican Bird Resurvey Project, or MBIRP for short, is partnering with eBird to use modern community science data on where birds are now to compare those collected or seen by Charles Lamb from 1933 to 1955. The project is also sequencing the genomes of 20 select species whose habitats have been altered to search for evidence of changes to DNA. So without further ado, let's turn it over to John so he can relate this fascinating scientific effort. So please welcome Dr. John McCormick.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was such a nice introduction. I'm going to share my screen. So Susan did a really great job of kind of introducing the general idea behind this work, which I think is really going to be interesting to you because a big part of it leverages all of these eBird data that you all have been putting onto eBird for years now. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the ways that we can really make those data maximally useful for science. So this is a story about Mexico. And Mexico is really not some place that has been completely pristine in its habitat until recently. In fact, there's a very long history of humans altering the habitat since their first arrival. So what I'm showing you here is a mural painted by Diego Rivera of Tenochtitlan, which is basically what is today Mexico City, and the massive works that they did at that time of the Aztecs and before, to fill in the lakes there and create a city on what was essentially a wetland. So humans have always been changing the habitat. Um, Much later, in the early 1900s, the forests started to be cleared for things like coffee plantations. And it was around this time in the early 1930s that a person named Robert T. Moore, who had recently resettled himself in Pasadena from the East Coast, took an interest in the bird life of Mexico. He was fresh off of a couple expeditions in Ecuador, and he was looking for something to devote his ornithological interests to. And he thought that Mexico would be the place to do it. He hired another Los Angeleno, a fellow named Chester Lamb, to do most of the collecting. And this started off to great effect. Right away, Lamb and Moore discovered a new species to the world, the tufted jay, and described it new to Western science, of course. The indigenous peoples of Mexico in that area knew that it was there. And what Chester Lamb did basically for the next 22 years was travel all around Mexico to all these sites you see with the red dots on the left, collecting birds and shipping them back to Moore, basically for $1 a bird. By the time he was done in 1955, Lamb had pretty much single-handedly collected 40,000 specimens over about 300 sites. And however you feel about collecting, what is absolutely true is that what these collections provide is really a snapshot in time of the distributions of birds in Mexico at a certain time and place, that being the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And we have those birds now at the Moore Laboratory of Zoology at Occidental College. And what you're seeing here actually are some photos of the old facilities. They're housed in new facilities, shiny new facilities in cases now. So even when Lamb was doing his collecting, he saw that the habitat was changing. I'm locating you onto one site in Durango where Lamb visited several times. This is a place near El Salto, up in the high elevation forests of Durango. Kind of zooming in here on the Google map so you could see still fairly heavily forested area. When Lamb first visited in 1939, we have his field notes so we can read about his impressions of the place. He said, left early and rode to a place known as Neveros, very close to El Salto. Today's ride was straight up the mountains for 5 hours over a terribly rough and stony trail. The country traveled in the last 2 days has been just a succession of mountainous ridges through pine and oak forests. Here it is mostly pines of good size. So that's 1938. He visited the same site 10 years later in 1948, and this is what he said. There is in course of construction a highway from Mazatlan to Durango, much of it being built. La Ciudad is only some 15 minutes drive from Neveros, where once I had made camp, going by mules from Mazatlan. Now there is a sawmill here. So he was noticing these changes, and the construction of this road from Durango to Mazatlan, which perhaps many of you listening in have actually driven for birding trips in Mexico. 3 years later, in 1951, he said, now the place is much changed. There is a large sawmill and lumber mill and score or more of houses. Still in parts looks favorable for birds. All the large pines have been logged off. So this was Lamb's experience during the time he was collecting. And really that only accelerated after the 1950s. So what you're seeing here is actually almost like a comic strip put out by the Mexican government and their Department of Natural Resources talking about logging in the high elevation mountain ranges, mainly at that time in 1952, done by hand and then hauled off by mules. But that was quickly changing, and the construction of roads allowed trucks to get up into the high elevation forests, and the logging really quickened in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. So we have habitat loss, we have the construction of dams, which made giant reservoirs, which filled in lowland habitat for birds. We had climate change that was happening apace, And then we also had massive and finally mechanized agriculture. For instance, in the western coastal lowlands, being converted from things like thorn scrub into irrigated agriculture, predominantly in the 1970s. So big changes after Lamb made his collections. And this was really the basis for a grant that was funded several years ago now, which is the basis for the Mexican Bird Resurvey Project, integrating undergraduate research, citizen science, and museum genomics to explore a century of changed North American birds. You can kind of follow along, especially on some of the on-the-ground field surveys that we do at www.mexicanbirdresurvey.org. So the big effort that we are involved in at the moment, this is kind of a multi-pronged project involving DNA stuff in the lab. I won't be talking about that. Mainly right now, postdoc in the lab, Dr. Ryan Terrell, has been working hard to compare our specimen data that was from generally the time when Lamb was active to more modern eBird data collected by observers just like you who might be traveling through Mexico, or local Mexican birders from 1991 to 2021, and to use those data to assess how bird distributions have changed over that time period as a result of those human-mediated habitat changes. This is a big collaborative project. Ryan is taking the lead on it, but it involves Mexican collaborators like Adolfo Navarro at the museum in Mexico City, Vicente Rodriguez in Conabio, Town Peterson at Kansas University, and very, very close help from Morgan Tingley at UCLA, who has developed some of the methods that we're using. So getting into how you might make these comparisons, one might start with kind of a simple, or if you will, the dumb way to do it, which is just to compare the number of areas where the bird was collected originally back in Lamb's time to the places where it was sighted more recently. So you're seeing some data along those lines here for military macaw. Over here on the left, you can see all of the little hexagonal cells. Those are all places where Lamb was at some point during his travel. So they were sampled by him at some time. The ones that are filled in red are the ones where he either saw or collected military macaw during his time in Mexico. Over on the right, you have eBird records, post 2000, of where military macaws have been sighted, of those places where Lamb traveled. And so in this case, you might come to the naive conclusion, well, look at this. This is great news, right? Military macaws seem to be increasing all over Mexico. But in fact, we know that that's not the case. And we know that probably there's something about comparing those old museum records to modern observations that is not such a great idea in terms of just the raw counts. And so we have been trying to develop methods with Morgan Tingley for how we compare museum to observational records. So a birder like Steve Howell down here at the bottom to the collections and sightings of Chester Lamb here at the top. I'm showing you now another set of distribution maps for fantail warbler records where Lamb collected it up on the top or saw it, and down on the bottom where modern birders have seen it. And so you realize pretty quickly when you start doing this that it's really not just about where a bird is collected or detected, but the probability that that bird actually inhabited or is inhabiting that little grid cell where it was not detected. Because there's many, many places where people just either haven't traveled or they did travel there and they missed the bird. It's really all about those non-detections that we need to correct for. And so you can kind of think of it this way. In the middle here, we've got the probability of occupancy for a given one of those grid cells by a given species of bird. And we have to take into account, and what Ryan and Morgan are doing is taking into account who was there, who is doing the observing, and what is kind of their track record on observing birds. How was that bird collected? Was it a sighting record? Was it a collection record? How much effort did the person actually put into seeing birds? Did they just spend a little bit of time there, or did they spend a lot of time? How thorough was the survey? Did they end up seeing most of the birds that are there, or had they really not detected much of the diversity because maybe they only spent a few days? And then we can even incorporate other things like, what is the climate and the habitat like? Was it even a suitable area to see this species? That also kind of plays a role in whether we expect it to occupy that cell or not. And so we can put all of these things into a big analysis. And for each grid cell at each time period, we can say, was the bird probably there or probably not? So when we do that, and now what I'm showing you is a map of the military macaw that compares the probability of detection in the historical times to the probability of detection in the modern times, and gives you a percent change between those two time periods. So now you're seeing kind of the scale over here on the right. If the macaw was increasing, you'd see it more in the blue colors and purple. And if it's decreasing, it's going to be in the pink or the red. So you can see across most of its range, military macaws, as we know, are decreasing pretty pretty dramatically, sometimes up to 50% or more of their historical occupancy. So a couple features of these maps is not only the color, but also the transparency of the cell. So when a cell is really, really dark, that means also that military macaws, it's likely to be part of their range. Whereas a cell that's very kind of shaded out and kind of pale is a cell that's like, there's a chance that this isn't actually really even part of the range of military macaws. So I'm going to show you a few of these maps, and now I'm going to add in just a couple more features that we can look at. One of them is up here on the top, and we can look at elevational change. So really what you can focus in on here is that the leftmost graph is historical, and the rightmost graph is modern time period. And then for this top piece, elevation is on the x-axis. And then we're also adding in the occupancy of the bird in primary, like very high quality primary habitat cover for historical and for modern. And so a conclusion we can draw for the fantail warbler here is that it has a positive association with primary habitat cover. And as we can see, so this bird is tightly linked with primary forest. We can see that from the positive association of the line here. It's got a positive slope. And then we can also see from the map that the bird is getting pretty hammered all across Mexico. You got to be a little careful on the scale bar here because it changes for each species. So these are not quite as dramatically bad as for the military macaw, because it only gets down to like a 12% change here, all the way down at the bottom. But still not good across most of its range. And so for this bird, we could say, this is a bird tightly linked with primary forest. It's decreasing across most of its range, and this may have something to do with habitat loss. Here we have another lowland tropical dry forest bird in the yellow grosbeak. Looking down here at our habitat associations, we can see that it's just a flat line, which means it's actually not tightly linked to primary cover. And still this bird is decreasing, but again, you can see on the scale bar, we're only talking on the order of 4% now. So decreasing, but less so maybe because of that not so tight association with primary forest. Let's turn our eye to some highland birds. Now we're looking at the red warbler. It has some association with primary habitat cover, maybe not super strong, but it is also decreasing in many areas of its range, although those decreases are a little bit more patchy. Here's a bird, eared quetzal, that is very tightly linked with primary forest. You can see here, super tight association. And this is another one of those that is just getting really completely hammered across its range, with some decreases up to 40% of its historical occupancy. So the kind of takeaway here is birds with associations to primary forest are not doing very well, as we might expect. And but even birds that do not have tight associations are also declining. All right, well, let's look at some of the birds that are actually increasing in some areas. Great-tailed grackle. You can think of this as like a forest-avoiding generalist. Down here, we can see now a negative association between how much it's predicted and primary habitat cover. And it is expanding into green areas across many parts of its range, the green and the blue, and really not decreasing anywhere across Mexico. This is a bird that's known to be expanding its range. Here we have patonga sulfuratus. This is another bird that is a forest-avoiding generalist. And not only is it increasing and expanding across a lot of its range, but it actually also seems to be moving into higher elevation. And this is a pattern we see also with a lot of these forest-avoiding generalists, is they're expanding and they seem to also be moving upslope. So really cool to be producing these species by species maps, and on a kind of a granular level across all of Mexico, be able to see some of the changes going on in these birds. Some of them sort of back up what we previously knew, and some of them are new information that was not intuitive just from our knowledge of what's happening on the ground. So I want to talk a little bit now about some of the resurveys we've actually been doing on the ground in Mexico. We have a goal to visit 15 sites that LAM surveyed and conduct our own resurveys in person, using binoculars as opposed to shotguns this time. You can actually see a short, it's about a 13 minute video on a few of these resurveys we've done. If you just Google records of change in quotes, it should be one of the top hits. And it'll give you a little view into some of the places we've been traveling. I'm going to tell you about one right now, and this was our resurvey a few years ago to a place not so far away from here, just a little south of the border in Baja California, in a mountain range called the Sierra San Pedro Martir. This was a place we went. If you look on iNaturalist, you can find a project that we did that recorded all of the species, not just birds, that we saw on this resurvey site. We've kind of been trying to make iNaturalist projects for each of our resurveys and document almost everything we see with cameras. One of the places we focused on was a place where LAM visited in the 1920s called LaGruya Meadow, a high elevation natural meadow on the top of this mountain range. Very cool place, kind of a land of giants. You've got these huge boulders in the middle of the meadow, huge pine trees. This place has basically been untouched by humans and by logging basically forever. It's one of the first parks, national parks, that was ever protected in Mexico. And so it is pretty much protected in state, and it is an amazing place. We did some fun rephotography while we were there, photographs from that area going back to the early 1900s, and we were trying to refine some of these places and rephoto them to see changes in the habitat. Some of the places were easier to find than others, right? When you have these great rock formations. They make them kind of easy to pick out as you pass by them. But what we saw in these rephotographs is in the high elevation, sure, this tree or that tree is gone and one has regrown, but not a lot of massive changes to the habitat. If anything, what you're seeing here is another rephotograph from the same LaGruya Meadow. If anything, it seems like the area, though, has maybe gotten a bit drier. So standing bodies of water, as you can see here, have kind of dried up, although some of those may be seasonal. Here's a rephotograph, not from the meadow, but just because it was really interesting, more from the coast north of Ensenada. Major changes that humans are making to the coastline. Here's another one from a high elevation meadow. It's kind of the neighboring meadow in the Sierra San Pedro Martir from 1925 to 2018. A huge pine tree out there in the middle of the meadow that we were actually able to relocate, essentially, the fallen tree. So this is not a tree that was cut down for logging. Even the fallen husk of it was never carted away or chopped up for firewood, such as the amount of protection in the area. It basically died of old age and fell over and still lies there in state, which really, it tells you a lot about the protection of this area. In fact, this tree is so massive that it can actually be seen from space. So this is a Google Maps view of the same meadow, and you can see as we zoom in on this middle section, you can see the fallen tree just lying there in the place where it fell. So if it's not habitat loss, if it's not logging, what might be going on here? Like I mentioned, there might be some increased aridity, some loss of water, and some dryness creeping in. We noted two lists of birds. On the left here, you have birds that were recorded by Lamb, but that were missing from our survey. So some of these things, spotted owl, American kestrel, Clark's nutcracker, I mean, these could just be from the fact that we only spent a few days there and we were just going to miss a few things that Lamb saw. Maybe more interesting, over on the right-hand column here are the birds not recorded by Lamb during his survey, but that were present in our survey. And I want you to especially take a look at the top two birds here, rock wren and lark sparrow. So these are two birds that if they were present in Lamb's time, he would not have missed them. He at least would have noted them in his field notes as existing. And these rock wrens that we noted were all over the meadow. There was like one on every rock. They were flying around. They were singing. They were nest building. They were kind of all over the place, very conspicuous. It's not a very conspicuous bird, but its behavior and its song is incredibly, and its behavior very, very conspicuous. And so, this needs an explanation. And if it's not habitat loss, we're thinking maybe the answer here is climate change. And so what's so great about the really high-powered analyses we're doing is that we can go back in then and say, okay, like we noted this observation anecdotally. It's kind of a fun story. Maybe there's something going on here, but what do the data really say about it? And so we can look at actually the map of change of the rock wren and see a pretty interesting pattern. So in a lot of the desert areas, the low elevation areas where you see rock wrens, they do seem to be declining. So deserts are getting hotter, deserts are getting drier, and rock wrens are suffering. But they also seem to be at least holding steady or maybe even increasing in a lot of high elevation areas in the Sierra Madres, and also this little blip up here in the Sierra San Pedro San Martir. So really cool to have these on the ground, fun little stories. Well, not so fun from the perspective of climate change, but something you observe with your eyes that you're then be able to go in and back up with real data and real analyses. So, kind of zooming out to the big picture of what we're doing with all of these kinds of data, um, we're going to be producing these maps of change for every species in Mexico, which will be a feat unto itself. And, each one of those you'll be able to analyze at that really granular level. And then we're going to be compiling all that information, all of those maps, to assess change in bird occupancy by geographic region, let's say, comparing North Mexico to South, the lowland forests to the high elevation forests, so habitat type, by taxonomic group, how are raptors doing compared to shorebirds, compared to primary forest birds, compared to generalists, and by ecological guilds, like I mentioned, raptors or nectar feeding birds. Basically be able to create these big comprehensive analyses for change in the bird life of Mexico over the last 100 years. So we're really, really excited about that and what that can tell us. And another cool thing we'll be able to do is really assess what the drivers of that change is, because these models are going to include landscape cover from both the historical time periods and the modern time periods, as well as climate data from the historical periods and the modern periods. So we'll be able to say for each given species what happened here to cause this change. Was it changes in habitat, or was it changes in climate? So very, very exciting research. How you can help, keep uploading those eBird checklists. I mean, this is really the data that these analyses are driven off of. Every checklist, even if it is full of what you might think of as dreadfully common birds, helps us create these occupancy models. We need those repeated observations of the same species from lots of different places, from lots of different observers. So know that every time you submit a checklist, even if it just has 10 yellow-rumped warblers on it, that is useful for science. And another kind of exciting development is that we're now starting to use some of these same methods to start a similar effort for Los Angeles to historically compare the birds from previous time periods to today. So this just goes to show that even if you're not creating eBird checklists in Mexico, the birds that you're collecting around the city are going to be feeding into these same kinds of analyses. So thank you so much already for your participation in this research. And thank you so much for listening. I would be delighted to answer any questions in the chat or the Q&A.
John, that was really incredible and very, very enjoyable. Actually, I had a question right at the top while everyone's kind of getting their questions in line. Who is actually taking the lead in the Mexico resurvey? Are Mexican scientists taking the lead, or is Moore Lab taking the lead?
Yeah, we're kind of piecemealing it a little bit, like where we can be in touch with networks of birders down there. We've kind of been reaching out, and through the website, we've been getting people that have just been kind of getting in touch and saying, hey, I'm in the Yucatan. Can I go to some of these lamb sites and create a checklist? And then I'll send them the field notes so that they can kind of get as close to lamb site as possible and create checklists. So for the big analyses that Ryan is doing, we don't need necessarily checklists from like right where lamb was. I mean, it's helpful. We can piece it together from other checklists, but there's also the element of going back to the place and sampling right where lamb was. So when we go to these places in Mexico, like we did in the Sierra San Pedro Martir, or we did in the Tuxtla Mountains in Veracruz, we get in touch with local people, and it's a collaborative effort on the ground, tapping local knowledge. Yeah.
Fantastic. And so I take it when you're doing the actual resurvey, whether eBird or the actually physically going down, you're doing it in the same season or maybe even the same month as lamb?
we would love for that to be the case, but it's not always the case. And so that can certainly explain some of the differences that we will occasionally see between Lamb's records and
Right.
ours. I see down here in the comments, Lance has asked regarding red crossbills, what was the
Mm.
cone crop like during the resurvey, right?
Right.
Well, several
Right.
of you noted right away. Clark's nutcracker, red crossbill. Must have been a good cone crop when Lamb was there and probably not when you were there. And I think that that was the
That
case.
may okay. Mark, do we have any
Wonderful.
Q&As?
Um, well, continuing with the chat, Lance has another question,
Mm.
which is, in addition to visual surveys using binoculars, what about using audio surveys with automatic recording units like sound loggers? This could be important because there might be some species that you hear but don't see.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that is absolutely true. For our last visit, COVID has put a stop to all of these on the ground visits, unfortunately, for the time being. But our last visit several summers ago was to Veracruz in the Tuxtlas, and we brought one of these sound recorders that you can just set up on a tree and let continuously run. And I have to say, we have not analyzed any of that, but we are kind of getting our legs under us some of the analytical methods for using machine learning, or basically like artificial intelligence, that can just go through and scan these really long audio files and pull out the bird song so that a human being doesn't have to sit there and listen to like 72 hours of audio recording. And I think you're absolutely right. Once we finally get that up and running, it is going to catch some of those species that are very hard to detect, which Lamb may have not have detected either,
Yeah.
because he was often very focused on things that were, they're easy to shoot.
Or
Well, that
shootable.
was another follow-up. My question is, did Lamb do any? I mean, I don't know if he had any sort of sound recorders. I mean, it wouldn't have been automated at the time, but
Probably not.
I mean,
No, he was his collections were very biased. And in fact, I didn't mention it in the talk, but in the time period that we're looking for the museum specimens, we are not just using Lamb, but we're using all museum records, and
Ah.
also any eBird records that anyone has gone back and historically uploaded from old
Mm.
field notes,
Mhm.
which is really cool, right? This idea of like, birding from the grave, essentially. Yeah, we can all hope to be immortalized on eBird one day, and so hopefully with all of those records, we get a good enough view of the birds that the occupancy models can kind of do the rest of the hard work. So that's the whole point of these things. These occupancy models
Mm.
is that for birds that are hard to detect, it can get you a kind of a better looking map that's more accurate.
Wow. Wow.
right, and those must be harder if you have, say, sound loggers in the modern times and don't have anything that equivalent in the previous
Exactly.
times. Yes.
Yeah, I mean it's harder, but again,
Yeah.
that is really basically what the occupancy models are there to do,
Mm-hmm.
is to say, hey, I've now figured out that there's something about this historical time period that they weren't picking up this species, because it's in a few places, but it's not in these others. But the habitat says that it's good for this species, and so its probability of being there, we're going to jack that up a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
because it was probably there, it just wasn't detected by Lamb.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Cool. So we have a few more questions. One, Mark Better asks, are there any ways that the data you're collecting will be linked with conservation activities in Mexico?
That would be great. I mean, that is kind of the hope. And our Mexican collaborators on this part of the project are embedded in the Mexican government and in their natural resources department. And so by producing these maps and making them available, we plan to just create a whole website that's basically just the maps of all the species and then conglomerate analyses of all of them. We're hoping to make a direct impact on conservation in Mexico.
Wow. And Los Angeles, I might add.
in Los Angeles, right?
Yeah.
I've got a question here from Frank and Susan about what is the spatial and seasonal resolution of the occupancy maps. Yeah, really good point, because a lot of birds are seasonal. We are trying to capture that. In terms of the spatial resolution, I couldn't tell you. Ryan could tell you offhand exactly the size of those little hexagonal grid cells. Yeah. Is
And
the
Great.
R code used to create the occupancy models publicly available? Um, when you run it through R, Python, Kaleidoscope, something else. So the R code to create the occupancy models is right now not publicly available because we're still working on it and we haven't published it yet. But there are ways to create occupancy models right now in R that I think are published. We've got some special tweaks to ours that we'll be rolling out kind of as part of what we want to publish is kind of updating the methodology as well. And then for the audio analysis, that is run in a proprietary software that may be called Kaleidoscope. Is that called Kaleidoscope? I can't remember. It's a pay to play software.
cool. And over in the chat, John, Allison Schultz asks, I'll let you take it actually.
Yeah, this may be too specific, but has it been difficult to create occupancy models from museum specimens, especially when you don't have effort for all collecting? Yeah, there are some birds that are just so little collected that the models just are not working. So we're hoping, there's 1,150 species that we have like on the great big list. We're thinking we'll be able to produce models for 1,000 of those species.
Okay. And then Lance asks, what about egg collections? Are they sufficiently complete to compare with Lamb's results and the resurvey results?
Yeah, I think that we have scooped up egg collections as part of our museum records. I think that they're included in the museum records. They would be less complete, though, than just specimen records for Mexico. People just were not doing the kind of egg collecting. But for Los Angeles, the eggs are a really big part of the deal, because egg collection was really, really huge in the late 1800s. I mean, every kid, it seemed like, had an egg collection in 1875. And a lot of those made their way to the Western Foundation. So, yeah.
Let's see. There's another question by Lily. Is climate change affecting subtropical species?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I would just naively say yes, definitely, because it seems to be affecting everything. But we really won't know relatively how much until we complete these analyses. So that's one of the big things we want to do, is be able to say not just yes, but how much, and how much in comparison to habitat loss, and how much for lowland tropical species compared to highland species, and so on and so forth, and get much more detailed about the causes and mechanisms.
Cool.
Okay, great. Lance also points out that yes, Kaleidoscope is the proprietary sound software
For wildlife acoustics.
from the same
from
company that
wildlife.
makes us the song meter recording units that Lance has talked about before.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we have Susan and Frank. Could these methods be extended to other countries and other regions?
Absolutely. So what we are hoping is that this will spark other kinds of studies in other places. As far as we're aware, this is the biggest application. So just kind of backtracking a little bit, Morgan Tingley kind of pioneered these methods and applying them to museum data specifically and comparing them to observational records. And they've done this with the Grinnell Resurvey of California up at Berkeley. And that's kind of where these methods got pioneered. This will be the largest application of them in terms of geographic coverage we think that has yet been done to date. And then, of course, applying it to different places and eventually expanding it out globally would be the next big steps.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I think everyone's pretty numb from information.
It was a lot of maps.
Oh,
That was great.
it actually was really, really fascinating, and you presented really, really well. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
I think that's it.
I think
Great.
that's it. Thank you so much, John.
Yeah, thank you all so much for inviting me back again. We have so many projects going on in the Moore Lab, it seems. I can, just keep coming back every year or so and present on a new topic.
All right. Actually, we'd love that. That's
We'll take you up on that.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's it's fascinating stuff going on at the Moore Lab, and it's literally in our backyard. It's certainly LA County. So
Yeah, we look forward to getting you there soon.
sounds great.
Yep.
And just as a reminder, next week, Tuesday at 7 o'clock, we have Tom Stevenson here to he promises to make Warbler ID easier. So please tune in and bring all your friends and family. Anything else, Mark?
I think that's it.
And
Thank you so
John,
much,
anything
John.
else?
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. It was great. Really appreciate your time and effort.
Thank you.
Thank you again. And I hope to see everyone next week.
Okay.
Yep.
Take
Bye.
care.
Bye.
Okay. Goodbye.